Sighing, Randy long looked at his reflection in the mirror. His friends Jimmy and Chip were standing inside his door, already in their costumes for the party, waiting on him. Unfortunately, Randy had been expecting to be working for the night and hadn't bothered to pick himself up a costume. Then just an hour ago, he'd gotten a call from his boss, saying not to bother showing up, and to enjoy himself. As he looked at his 6-foot, brown-haired self in the mirror, dressed in his usual jeans and t-shirt, he wondered just how he could enjoy himself. The party was a big one on campus, and wearing a costume was mandatory. "Sorry guys," Randy said reluctantly, "but I can't go." Randy looked at his friends enviously, thinking that at least they'd had time to get their costumes together. He couldn't help but chuckling at the costumes they'd chosen. Jimmy, who was fairly tall and thin, with a mop of unruly red hair, was going dressed up as his favorite comic book character, Gambit. He was even waving around a couple playing cards and talking in a bad-faked Cajun accent. Chip on the other hand was a bit shorter than Jimmy, but more muscular. Randy smiled at Chip's Wolverine costume, thinking that he was a bit too tall and not hairy enough to make it look good, but Chip didn't seem to care. And Randy had to laugh at the fake claws coming out of the gloves since Chip was stuck with them, getting in the way of everything. And then again, Randy had nothing, but that didn't stop his friends from telling him to come anyway. "Come in, Randy, no one will care," Chip pleaded. "Hurry up, or we'll miss the contest." Jimmy grumbled impatiently, looking at his watch. Chip grinned, then held up his fake claws, demanding, "You're coming with us, bub. Either the hard way or the easy way." Randy couldn't help but laugh at Chip. Maybe, he thought, it wouldn't hurt to show up. Still, he thought that it might be embarrassing to be the only person there without a costume. For the millionth time, he wished that he'd finished that Spider-Man costume that he'd originally planned to wear. But after his boss had told him he'd be working, he'd given up on it. Sighing, Randy really wished his boss would have made up his mind earlier. Looking over at his friends, Randy picked up some of the comic books he'd forgotten about, putting them on the coffee in a nice stack. For some reason, the back issue of X Factor caught his eye, and he really wished that they hadn't screwed that title up then canceled it. What a waste. Sighing again, Randy shrugged his shoulders and said, "All right, I'll go." "About friggin' time," Jimmy muttered, looking at his watch again. Chip just smiled and cracked open a beer, saying something about staying in character. Hesitating for just a moment, thinking that he'd made a mistake, Randy grabbed his jacket and hurried out the door with his friends. Walking into the door, Randy looked around nervously at everyone in their costumes. As far as he could tell, everyone was in costume. Everyone but him, that was. Turning a little, Randy noticed the 4 judges sitting at a table, watching the partygoers coming in, taking notes on their costumes. Chuckling, Randy noted that they'd apparently learned after the accusations of sexism the year before, when the all-male judges voted the head cheerleader the winner, in spite of her horrible costume. The only good thing about it was the amount of cleavage shown. This year though, only 2 of the judges were guys, with the other 2 being women. Randy could just imagine the arguments they'd have over who had the best costume, thankful at least that he certainly wouldn't qualify. As Randy looked over the judges, he smiled to himself, recognizing the guy in the alien costume as Bill Walsh, whom he often ran into at the local comic shop. Randy smiled, kind of liking Bill since they had the same interest in comics. "Hey man," Bill said, noticing Randy, "cool you could make it." Then Bill hesitated. "Sorry man, but you gotta have a costume." "Yeah, sure," Randy said, uncomfortably aware of Jimmy standing behind him still, though Chip had already gone in. "Let me guess," Bill said, smiling, "homicidal maniac. They look just like everybody else." Randy had to laugh at that, trying to think quickly. "No," he said smiling, then leaned over and whispered to Bill as if he were sharing a great secret, "I'm really Mystique, the mutant terrorist, sometimes hero. I shape-shifted myself into this disguise so that I could infiltrate this party." Bill broke out laughing at that, with Jimmy chuckling along. Randy just smiled, pleased at himself. "All right," Bill said, still chuckling, "you can go in." Surprised at actually being let in, Randy didn't stay around long enough for Bill to change his mind, hurrying into the main room. As Randy looked around at the large variety of costumes around him, he couldn't help but feel self-conscious again. There was one guy in a devil's costume, another guy dressed up as the Kool-Aid Man, and some woman whom he noticed seemed to have 4 breasts. Randy shook his head and tried to look for the food, already having lost track of Jimmy and Chip. After filling his plate up with chips and a couple small sandwiches, Randy looked around, trying to enjoy himself. He still felt a bit self-conscious about his lack of a costume, but whenever someone asked him why he didn't have one, he told them the same thing that he told Bill. Sometimes it earned him a laugh, but more often than not, the person he told didn't know anything about comic books, so only gave him a blank look. Randy was getting into enjoying himself when he turned around and bumped into a woman that was dressed up a bit like a hooker. "Sorry," he muttered, excusing himself. He blushed a little, aware that he was staring at this woman's breasts. Forcing himself to look up into her eyes, he saw that she was laughing, and blushed again. "Hey Randy," she asked, "where's your costume?" Randy stared at her for a moment, wondering who she was. He was sure that he didn't recognize her. At the blank look on Randy's face, the girl laughed again. "It's me, Tony Prescott," she said. Randy stared. No way, Tony was a guy, and this was obviously not a guy. "Yeah, sure," Randy said, smiling at the joke. "No, really," she said sincerely, then began fiddling with the black choker around her neck. Just as she undid it, she pulled it up, and Randy was startled to see her whole face peel back, just like a mask. Andy Tony's face was right there. All Randy could do was stare at Tony's face, then look down at the rest of Tony's body, which definitely didn't look like a guy's. "How the hell?" Randy asked, confused, making Tony laugh in his own voice again. Tony smirked, then lowered the whole head mask over his head again, snapping the choker when it was on. Once this was done, Randy couldn't tell that this was really a guy underneath. "I got this costume from some shop in the mall," Tony said with a smile, sounding once again like the beautiful woman he looked like. "Awesome, huh?" All Randy could do was nod his head. That was the most realistic-looking costume that he'd ever seen. All he could do was whistle, and watch as Tony excused himself to go flirt with a couple guys that didn't know who he was. Randy chuckled to himself, deciding that if Tony didn't win the Best Costume Award, he'd be more shocked than if he found out that Elvis was still alive and living in the White House. Shaking his head, Randy decided to look for his friends again, and eventually found Chip and Jimmy over by the punch bowl where they had a good glimpse at a couple of the girls. "Great view," he complimented them as he came up over. Randy noticed that Chip was about to say something, when a voice came over the intercom. "All right everyone," the voice announced. Randy turned his head to the stage up front, where he saw some guy dressed as a cowboy talking into the microphone. Bill and the female judges were behind him, making Randy remember that this was the other judge. "Now is the time for the annual Halloween costume contest," he continued smoothly, ignoring the cheers and loud comments. Curiously, Randy watched, waiting intently for the winners. He was sure that Tony should win with that costume of his. He wondered if maybe he should check out that costume shop in the mall that Tony mentioned for next year. Randy forced his attention back to the stage, seeing the third-place winner being called up. Some girl in an elaborate angel costume, with large wings coming out the back. Randy nodded, recognizing her as one of the snobby rich girls around campus, but couldn't help but admire how nice she looked anyway. When second place was called, Randy cheered, seeing that it was some guy he didn't know, but that the costume was excellent. Finally, first place was called, and Randy was pleased to watch Tony walk up, pulling off his mask to prove his identity, then gracefully accepting the trophy. Smiling, Randy watched all 3 of the costume winners still standing on stage, getting their pictures taken. Finally, the cowboy called from on the stage, but before he went any further, Randy noticed that Bill went over and said something to him. The cowboy nodded and sat down, leaving Bill to talk into the microphone. Sighing, Randy long looked at his reflection in the mirror. His friends Jimmy and Chip were standing inside his door, already in their costumes for the party, waiting on him. Unfortunately, Randy had been expecting to be working for the night and hadn't bothered to pick himself up a costume. Then just an hour ago, he'd gotten a call from his boss, saying not to bother showing up, and to enjoy himself. As he looked at his 6-foot, brown-haired self in the mirror, dressed in his usual jeans and t-shirt, he wondered just how he could enjoy himself. The party was a big one on campus, and wearing a costume was mandatory. "Sorry guys," Randy said reluctantly, "but I can't go." Randy looked at his friends enviously, thinking that at least they'd had time to get their costumes together. He couldn't help but chuckling at the costumes they'd chosen. Jimmy, who was fairly tall and thin, with a mop of unruly red hair, was going dressed up as his favorite comic book character, Gambit. He was even waving around a couple playing cards and talking in a bad-faked Cajun accent. Chip, on the other hand, was a bit shorter than Jimmy, but more muscular. Randy smiled at Chip's Wolverine costume, thinking that he was a bit too tall and not hairy enough to make it look good, but Chip didn't seem to care. And Randy had to laugh at the fake claws coming out of the gloves since Chip was stuck with them, getting in the way of everything. And then again, Randy had nothing, but that didn't stop his friends from telling him to come anyway. "Come in, Randy, no one will care," Chip pleaded. "Hurry up, or we'll miss the contest." Jimmy grumbled impatiently, looking at his watch. Chip grinned, then held up his fake claws, demanding, "You're coming with us, bub. Either the hard way or the easy way." Randy couldn't help but laugh at Chip. Maybe, he thought, it wouldn't hurt to show up. Still, he thought that it might be embarrassing to be the only person there without a costume. For the millionth time, he wished that he'd finished that Spider-Man costume that he'd originally planned to wear. But after his boss had told him he'd be working, he'd given up on it. Sighing, Randy really wished his boss would have made up his mind earlier. Looking over at his friends, Randy picked up some of the comic books he'd forgotten about, putting them on the coffee in a nice stack. For some reason, the back issue of X Factor caught his eye, and he really wished that they hadn't screwed that title up then canceled it. What a waste. Sighing again, Randy shrugged his shoulders and said, "All right, I'll go." "About friggin' time," Jimmy muttered, looking at his watch again. Chip just smiled and cracked open a beer, saying something about staying in character. Hesitating for just a moment, thinking that he'd made a mistake, Randy grabbed his jacket and hurried out the door with his friends. Walking into the door, Randy looked around nervously at everyone in their costumes. As far as he could tell, everyone was in costume. Everyone but him, that was. Turning a little, Randy noticed the 4 judges sitting at a table, watching the partygoers coming in, taking notes on their costumes. Chuckling, Randy noted that they'd apparently learned after the accusations of sexism the year before, when the all-male judges voted the head cheerleader the winner, in spite of her horrible costume. The only good thing about it was the amount of cleavage shown. This year though, only 2 of the judges were guys, with the other 2 being women. Randy could just imagine the arguments they'd have over who had the best costume, thankful at least that he certainly wouldn't qualify. As Randy looked over the judges, he smiled to himself, recognizing the guy in the alien costume as Bill Walsh, whom he often ran into at the local comic shop. Randy smiled, kind of liking Bill since they had the same interest in comics. "Hey man," Bill said, noticing Randy, "cool you could make it." Then Bill hesitated. "Sorry man, but you gotta have a costume." "Yeah, sure," Randy said, uncomfortably aware of Jimmy standing behind him still, though Chip had already gone in. "Let me guess," Bill said, smiling, "homicidal maniac. They look just like everybody else." Randy had to laugh at that, trying to think quickly. "No," he said smiling, then leaned over and whispered to Bill as if he were sharing a great secret, "I'm really Mystique, the mutant terrorist, sometimes hero. I shape-shifted myself into this disguise so that I could infiltrate this party." Bill broke out laughing at that, with Jimmy chuckling along. Randy just smiled, pleased at himself. "All right," Bill said, still chuckling, "you can go in." Surprised at actually being let in, Randy didn't stay around long enough for Bill to change his mind, hurrying into the main room. As Randy looked around at the large variety of costumes around him, he couldn't help but feel self-conscious again. There was one guy in a devil's costume, another guy dressed up as the Kool-Aid Man, and some woman whom he noticed seemed to have 4 breasts. Randy shook his head and tried to look for the food, already having lost track of Jimmy and Chip. After filling his plate up with chips and a couple small sandwiches, Randy looked around, trying to enjoy himself. He still felt a bit self-conscious about his lack of a costume, but whenever someone asked him why he didn't have one, he told them the same thing that he told Bill. Sometimes it earned him a laugh, but more often than not, the person he told didn't know anything about comic books, so only gave him a blank look. Randy was getting into enjoying himself when he turned around and bumped into a woman that was dressed up a bit like a hooker. "Sorry," he muttered, excusing himself. He blushed a little, aware that he was staring at this woman's breasts. Forcing himself to look up into her eyes, he saw that she was laughing, and blushed again. "Hey Randy," she asked, "where's your costume?" Randy stared at her for a moment, wondering who she was. He was sure that he didn't recognize her. At the blank look on Randy's face, the girl laughed again. "It's me, Tony Prescott," she said. Randy stared. No way, Tony was a guy, and this was obviously not a guy. "Yeah, sure," Randy said, smiling at the joke. "No, really," she said sincerely, then began fiddling with the black choker around her neck. Just as she undid it, she pulled it up, and Randy was startled to see her whole face peel back, just like a mask. Andy Tony's face was right there. All Randy could do was stare at Tony's face, then look down at the rest of Tony's body, which definitely didn't look like a guy's. "How the hell?" Randy asked, confused, making Tony laugh in his own voice again. Tony smirked, then lowered the whole head mask over his head again, snapping the choker when it was on. Once this was done, Randy couldn't tell that this was really a guy underneath. "I got this costume from some shop in the mall," Tony said with a smile, sounding once again like the beautiful woman he looked like. "Awesome, huh?" All Randy could do was nod his head. That was the most realistic-looking costume that he'd ever seen. All he could do was whistle, and watch as Tony excused himself to go flirt with a couple guys that didn't know who he was. Randy chuckled to himself, deciding that if Tony didn't win the Best Costume Award, he'd be more shocked than if he found out that Elvis was still alive and living in the White House. Shaking his head, Randy decided to look for his friends again, and eventually found Chip and Jimmy over by the punch bowl where they had a good glimpse at a couple of the girls. "Great view," he complimented them as he came up over. Randy noticed that Chip was about to say something, when a voice came over the intercom. "All right everyone," the voice announced. Randy turned his head to the stage up front, where he saw some guy dressed as a cowboy talking into the microphone. Bill and the female judges were behind him, making Randy remember that this was the other judge. "Now is the time for the annual Halloween costume contest," he continued smoothly, ignoring the cheers and loud comments. Curiously, Randy watched, waiting intently for the winners. He was sure that Tony should win with that costume of his. He wondered if maybe he should check out that costume shop in the mall that Tony mentioned for next year. Randy forced his attention back to the stage, seeing the third-place winner being called up. Some girl in an elaborate angel costume, with large wings coming out the back. Randy nodded, recognizing her as one of the snobby rich girls around campus, but couldn't help but admire how nice she looked anyway. When second place was called, Randy cheered, seeing that it was some guy he didn't know, but that the costume was excellent. Finally, first place was called, and Randy was pleased to watch Tony walk up, pulling off his mask to prove his identity, then gracefully accepting the trophy. Smiling, Randy watched all 3 of the costume winners still standing on stage, getting their pictures taken. Finally, the cowboy called from on the stage, but before he went any further, Randy noticed that Bill went over and said something to him. The cowboy nodded and sat down, leaving Bill to talk into the microphone. "All right," Bill said with a big grin on his face, "now is our award for the lamest costume." Randy had a suddenly sinking feeling, especially at the way Bill was looking over in his direction. Randy also noticed that a couple of the people around him were giving him quick glances. "The winner of the lamest costume is..." Bill paused for dramatic effect, "Randy Long." Randy winced, feeling his cheeks turning bright red. "Go on, buddy," Chip cheered, pushing Randy forward. Horribly embarrassed, Randy walked up to the stage, climbing the steps and feeling almost as if he were walking up the steps to his hanging. He had a strong temptation to turn and run, but knew that he'd never live that down, so sucked up the humiliation and forced himself to stand tall and straight. When Randy got next to Bill, who was smirking at him, Randy had to smile in spite of himself. "Now this," Bill said to the audience, "is the lamest costume this year." He gestured at Randy, then turned to the crowd. "This is his costume of a comic book shape-shifting super-villainous," he coughed for a second, "and occasionally hero, Mystique." Randy felt his face turning beet red, and stared at his shoes while the audience booed, as was traditional for each year's lamest costume awards. Randy cursed himself once again for coming, knowing that he should have expected this. Randy glared at Bill, who just smiled back, and pulled something out of a box, holding it up. It was some kind of medallion that had a cheap-looking plastic face. Randy snorted, while Bill let everyone see it. "I got this from a man who claims to be a wizard," Bill stated out loud, earning a couple more laughs. Bill waited for the applause to die down, then continued. He said that this would make any Halloween costume more realistic, and boy could Randy use this. Everyone was laughing, and Randy felt completely embarrassed as Bill slipped the plastic-looking necklace around his neck. Randy froze for a second, feeling a strange tingling running through his whole body. He gulped, suddenly feeling a bit strange. Putting it down to the stress and embarrassment, Randy gulped, and faced his audience. Trying to keep some pride, Randy forced himself to smile, then give a nice bow to the audience, earning him a few more boos but also a couple cheers for the good way he was taking it. Relieved, he finally left the stage, glad to be out of the spotlight. When Randy got off of the stage, Chip slapped him on the shoulder, congratulating him on his winning, while Jimmy just smirked and said that he was glad it wasn't him. Still blushing and feeling embarrassed, Randy just kept quiet and tried to enjoy the rest of the part. He decided though that next year he was going to have a costume ready well in advance, even if he wasn't going to go. Chuckling to himself, he realized that it would definitely pay to be prepared. Randy stayed with the party for another hour, but kept having the feeling that something wasn't right. He wasn't sure, and thought that maybe the strange feelings he was getting were his imagination, caused by the alcohol he'd been drinking. Finally, he had enough and excused himself from Jimmy and Chip, saying he was heading home for some sleep. Yawning, Randy scratched at his neck, thinking that he was feeling some strange tingling again. Shaking his head, he decided to just get home quicker. As soon as Randy got back to his dorm room, he collapsed onto his bed, not even bothering to take off his clothes before falling asleep. As Randy woke up, he remembered the night before, and smiled at the memory. He knew that he'd hear about winning the lamest costume award for a while, but it had been pretty fun, so Randy was glad that he'd made it to the party, award and all. Opening his eyes, Randy became aware that something wasn't right. He wasn't sure what, and glanced around the room, noticing nothing that seemed different. Then he realized that he didn't feel right. That somehow, he felt strange. "What a hangover," he muttered to himself, sure that alcohol must be the explanation. Hesitating, he thought that his voice sounded strange, but shook it off, deciding that it was just more of his imagination. Feeling a slight crink in his neck, Randy reached back to scratch at it, having his fingers encounter a small chain. He stopped for a second, confused, then remembered the cheesy prize he'd won. Randy left it for the moment, and started to stand up, again aware that he didn't feel right. It was then that he looked down at himself and gasped in shock. The most obvious thing he saw was that his skin had somehow turned blue. All Randy could do was stare at his hand, then hold it up, seeing that it was all colored a somewhat dark blue. Thinking that it must be some kind of a joke, that one of his friends had painted him while he slept, Randy got up and hurried to the bathroom. Turning on the water, he put his hands in, and tried washing them off, almost panicking when they weren't coming clean. Looking up, he caught his reflection in the mirror, and his eyes widened in disbelief. Staring back from the mirror was a blue-skinned woman, with red hair. Randy gasped, taking a step back. "What the hell is going on?" he asked aloud, feeling very scared all of a sudden. He recognized that face. Nervously, he looked again, seeing the solid yellow eyes, and the feminine features that looked a couple years older than he was. It was Mystique, the comic book character that he was joking about the night before. Nervously, he looked down, seeing the other things he'd noticed earlier, but had ignored due to the blue skin. His chest pushed out into two mounds, and wincing, Randy grabbed them, sure that they must be fake. As his hands squeezed them, Randy gulped, feeling his fingers digging in. Letting go, Randy stared at his breasts, aware that they were real. That somehow, he had breasts. That somehow, he looked like a comic book character. Randy touched himself, already having noticed that his clothes had changed as well. He hadn't noticed them when he got up since they felt comfortable on him, but now, he saw that they definitely weren't the clothes he went to sleep in. Instead, he seemed to be wearing Mystique's costume. One of the ones she'd been wearing in X Factor when she was a member. He had the white costume on, with the black trim and the red jacket. Horrified, but already knowing what he'd find, Randy slipped a hand between his legs, confirming that nothing was there. That his familiar genitals were definitely missing. Gasping, Randy sat down on the toilet, staring down at himself. This couldn't be happening, it just couldn't. Randy knew that this wasn't possible, that this kind of thing just didn't happen in real life. Nervously, Randy got up, forcing himself to walk back down the hall to his dorm room, thankful that no one had seen him. Closing the door behind him, he looked around the room, wondering what could have done this. It must have been one of his friends, he decided, but then, he couldn't figure out how they played this joke on him. He looked just like Mystique, and even had the breasts to prove it. Randy started pulling his clothes off, quickly stripping out of this costume that was covering him. He tossed the cheap prize necklace from the night before onto his couch, and looked down at his now naked body, seeing that he was completely blue-skinned. Nervously, he examined between his legs, seeing the patch of red pubic hair, which stood out among the blue skin surrounding it. Nervously, he touched his new vagina, noting that his fingernails were longer as well. It felt sensitive to touch himself there, and he pulled his hand back. This can't be happening, Randy said to himself. It just can't. But still, in spite of what he was telling himself, he knew that it was happening. He just didn't know how. Didn't know how a normal guy could suddenly look so completely like a woman. So completely like a comic book character at that. Randy saw the curves on his body, wincing at them, noting however that his new body seemed athletic and in very good shape. He almost smiled to himself, realizing that of course it would be, since Mystique was a comic character, and all comic women were in great shape, with fantastic figures. Carefully he sat down on his couch, still naked, trying to figure out what had happened. Trying to get comfortable, he crossed his legs like a woman, barely realizing that he'd done so. Randy forced himself to ignore the temptation his naked body offered, trying instead to focus on what could have caused this. Randy bit his lip, then remembered something. Randy remembered Tony Prescott, and how last night he had seemed to be a woman when in costume. It had been too real to believe. Now Randy wasn't so sure anymore. He realized that if anyone knew about this, it would have to be Tony. After struggling with himself for several minutes, he decided to call Tony and ask him what was going on. The phone rang and rang, but Randy still wasn't getting through. He looked over at the clock, seeing that it was nearly 11 o'clock. Damn! Randy sputtered, wondering where the hell Tony was. He probably spent the night with some girl he impressed, Randy decided. Sighing, he knew that he'd have to do something about this, and soon. Trying to ignore the weight of the breasts hanging from his chest, Randy started getting dressed again, realizing immediately that his own clothes wouldn't fit him right in this shape, and that the costume would be the only thing that would work. As he struggled with one of the white boots, he thought how appropriate this costume was at the moment anyway. When he'd gotten the costume back on, Randy was amazed at how comfortable it felt. It was almost like a second skin in places. He looked at the heels on the boots, and wondered briefly how he'd managed to walk around in them without even noticing them. It felt so natural and easy to do so, when he knew that it shouldn't. Somehow, he realized, it was part of whatever changed him, making it a little easier. He was just thankful that the heels weren't huge. He didn't think he could handle that, no matter how well whatever it was adapted him. Opening his door, Randy peeked out, hoping that no one would notice him. When he was sure the coast was clear, he hurried into the bathroom again, and into one of the stalls. He didn't really want to do this, but his bladder felt full and he certainly didn't want any accidents. Reluctantly, he got his costume off enough so that he could sit down. "I hope no one comes in," he prayed, then let loose with his bladder. He sighed when he'd finished, finding the relief to be the same. Then he saw how wet he was between his legs. Quickly he used some toilet paper to make sure that he was dried off, then slipped his costume back on right. "I always wondered how people could go to the bathroom in spandex costumes," he muttered, thinking about the comic book superheroes and how much of a pain it must be for some of them to just take a leak. He was actually relieved that this costume was much easier to do that business in. Randy looked nervously at the door, hoping that it wouldn't open. Then he went in front of the mirror again, staring at Mystique. The long red hair, the dark blue skin and the solid yellow eyes, all clearly visible. He smiled nervously, watching his reflection do the same. He thought it was incredibly strange to have this reflection looking back at him. It even looked a few years older than him, though that wasn't nearly as odd as the blue skin or that it was a woman. Still staring at his reflection, Randy began to wonder about something. Since something had made him look just like Mystique, and had even given him a costume, he wondered if maybe that wasn't all he'd been given. Carefully, he concentrated on his skin, willing it to get lighter. Before his eyes, the reflection in the mirror changed a little, the skin looking like normal skin rather than blue. Randy smiled and felt a thrill of triumph. Focusing again, he concentrated on his hair, turning it pure black, then on his clothes, making them look normal. Quickly, everything changed as he concentrated, and a different woman looked back at him from the mirror. She had black hair and was wearing glasses, and Randy couldn't help but smirk at this. He looked just like Mystique did in her Raven Darkholme identity. Randy was amazed. Whatever had changed him had also given him the comic character's powers as well. He could shape-shift, changing his appearance just by concentrating. Randy had to smile at that, and decided that maybe it wouldn't be quite so bad. With some more effort, he practiced in front of the mirror, making himself look like one woman after another, even like one of the girls he was in history class with. Finally satisfied that he could control it, Randy smiled and began his next change, carefully focusing on the desired results. Seconds later, Randy looked into the mirror, smiling to see his own face looking back. He'd done it. He'd managed to make himself look like he usually did. Still, something didn't feel quite right, which made him realize that even though he looked like his normal self, he wasn't. He wasn't sure how long he could keep looking normal, but he definitely wanted to take advantage of it while he could. Thinking for a few seconds, Randy decided that he really needed to talk to Tony. Since Tony wasn't answering his phone, Randy thought that maybe he should walk over there and see if any of the neighbors knew where Tony was. Randy smiled, his mind made up. Grinning back into the mirror, he turned to leave the bathroom, determined to find Tony, and hopefully some answers. Patiently, Randy waited for an answer at the door, and when none came, he knocked again. "Damn!" Randy snapped, glaring at the door. He'd been hoping to catch Tony home, but apparently he wasn't around. This was the second time he'd come by too. Nervously, Randy looked around, hoping to see some sign of where Tony might have gone. A small note, a girl's panties, or anything. However, as much as Randy looked, he didn't see any clues. Randy was really beginning to get worried since Tony was the only one that he knew of who might have some kind of answer, and he couldn't be found. After several more minutes of waiting, Randy knocked on a couple of the neighbors' doors down the dorm hall, but none of them had any idea where Tony was either, though a few made lewd suggestions. Apparently Randy realized he was the only person who was worried, and wondered if maybe he was overreacting about Tony. After all, it could be a coincidence, but he didn't think so. Finally Randy gave up on finding Tony at the moment and started heading back to his own room, thinking about what Tony had said the night before. that he'd gotten his costume at some place in the mall. Randy thought that might provide a clue, and was thinking of heading over to the mall when the feelings of strangeness swept through his body, making him gasp. His body hadn't felt quite right since he'd shape-shifted back into his own form a couple hours earlier, but now those feelings intensified drastically. Trying not to be noticed, Randy stepped behind some thick bushes and relaxed, finding his body suddenly changing on him. He could feel his breasts beginning to push out, while his testicles started pulling in. It was extremely rapid, and before he'd completely realized it or noticed all the changes that were occurring, it was done. Randy nervously looked down at himself, already knowing what he'd find. He was Mystique again. Once again, he was a red-headed woman with blue skin and a comic book costume. This time, as Randy looked around, it dawned on him that he was shorter than he was a few minutes ago, by several inches. He hadn't noticed that until after he'd just finished changing, since a branch that had been eye level was suddenly a little higher. Grabbing hold of his breasts, Randy thought that he needed to get back to normal, and soon. He didn't know how much more of this weirdness he could take. Feeling nervous and afraid that someone would see him like this, Randy kept hidden behind the bushes, hoping that no one would come back there. Looking down at his blue skin in distaste, Randy thought that he'd always liked Mystique as a comic book character, but he sure as hell never wanted to be her. As he was thinking this, Randy sat down, trying to relax. He didn't remember Mystique having this problem with keeping another shape for a long time in the comics, and was wondering why he did then. The more Randy thought about it, the more ridiculous he realized the question was. It was a comic book superpower that shouldn't work at all in the real world, and that it did was strange enough. Finally, Randy decided that if he actually did have the same powers, then it must be a matter of practice or something. That was the only thing that made sense to him. He only wished that he could have stayed as himself for a little longer before reverting. After resting for 15 minutes, Randy decided to try again, hoping that he'd rested enough so that he could use those powers again. Concentrating on his own body, he willed himself to change, and was pleased to feel his chest pulling in, and something beginning to push out between his legs. Getting distracted by these changes, he lost control and suddenly found himself all the way as Mystique again. Groaning, he realized that he apparently hadn't recovered quite enough to go back yet. Still though, he didn't think he could walk back like he was now without being noticed. Furiously, he glared at his blue hands, even if they were covered with white gloves. He couldn't believe this. All he'd done was say that he was dressed as Mystique during a costume party, and now he seemed to be her. Suddenly Randy froze, worried. If he'd become Mystique, just by saying he was dressed by her, did that mean that Jimmy had turned into Gambit and Chip into Wolverine? That idea wasn't very pleasant, though he reflected that if they had, they certainly got off a lot easier than he did. Worried about his friends, Randy grew more determined to get back to his room so that he could call them. He knew that he couldn't change back to normal right now, but he wondered if just maybe he could change just a few things. Just enough so as not to be noticed. Gathering his attention, he focused on his skin and costume, willing his skin to turn to the usual pinkish color, and his costume to turn into a t-shirt and jeans. Randy smiled, seeing that it was working. Standing up again, he felt thrilled that it had worked. Chuckling to himself, he thought how fun this shape-shifting thing could be. If he didn't keep changing back into Mystique, that was. Though he still looked like a woman, Randy decided that it was much better than staying behind the bushes. Nervously, he walked out, suddenly realizing that this was the first time that he'd been out in the open as a woman. Gulping, he wasn't sure that he liked that, but was determined not to let it scare him. Taking a lock of his still red hair into his hand, Randy smiled nervously, then let it fall back, very aware of the way his breasts were pushing out. As he walked, he could feel them bouncing along with him, rather uncomfortably. He wondered how the hell could women stand this. They were so distracting. Randy forced himself to stand up straight and hold his shoulders back, not aware of how this pushed his breasts out even further. Determined, he started out on his way, trying to get back without too much notice. It didn't take very long before Randy was aware of eyes watching him, and realized that it was one of the guys around campus. At first, he wondered what the guy was staring at, then he remembered what he looked like. Glancing down at the breasts, pushing out in front of him, he wondered how he could have forgotten these. Nervously, Randy tried to ignore the stare, feeling himself blushing anyway. When he heard a wolf whistle behind him, it took all of Randy's willpower not to turn around. He felt furious and humiliated. Randy wondered how that other guy could do that to him. He knew that he looked like a girl, but that was no reason to be staring at him like that. However, using all his willpower, Randy kept going, even quickening his step. Within a minute he was out of sight of his admirer, and let out a sigh of relief. But before his relief could register too much, he realized that there were several other guys around who were looking at him lustfully. Randy felt himself blushing more, and seriously thought about using his new power to make himself fat and ugly. Only his pride and vanity kept him from at least attempting it, thinking that it was better to be a good-looking woman than an ugly one. And he rationalized that it would take too much effort to maintain, knowing as he did so, that he could probably manage anyway. Caught up in his own thoughts, Randy wasn't paying complete attention to where he was going, and ran into somebody. Stepping back, Randy felt embarrassed, then noticed it was some guy that he ran into. "Sorry," the guy said, looking embarrassed. Randy chuckled, knowing full well that it was his own fault. Looking at the stranger in front of him, Randy knew that he'd seen him around the campus a few times, though didn't know his name. My name's Kyle," he said, introducing himself. Randy hesitated, trying to decide what to tell Kyle, then just smiled and told him, "My name's Renee." Randy chuckled inside at that, knowing that his mom had wanted to name him that if he'd been born a girl. Briefly he wondered just what she'd say about his current situation. "Pleased to meet you," Kyle said, holding out his hand. Randy smiled and shook hands, noticing that Kyle was staring into his eyes, making him feel rather embarrassed. Looking down, he heard Kyle say, "Interesting eyes." Randy wondered what Kyle meant with that comment, then realized suddenly that he'd forgotten to change his eyes along with his skin. They were still solid yellow. Gulping, Randy grew afraid that Kyle would think him some kind of freak, and maybe draw attention. Kyle seemed to notice Randy's embarrassment and coughed. "Must be those custom contact lenses I've heard about. They look so cool. Almost real too." Randy smiled, feeling relieved to have an excuse, then thanked Kyle for the compliment on his contacts. Randy nervously realized that he should be getting back to his room, and politely excused himself from Kyle, explaining that he had some errands to run. "Maybe I'll see you around, Renee," Kyle said politely, slowly walking off while keeping an eye on Randy. "Maybe." Randy heard himself calling back. As he started walking further away from Kyle, he realized that Kyle had a crush on him, making him chuckle, though the situation actually made him somewhat nervous. He thought that Kyle seemed like a pretty good guy, and wondered if maybe he liked comics. With only several more minor distractions, Randy managed to make it back to his dorms, and slip in the door without being noticed too much. Plopping down onto his couch, he blew out a sigh of relief, letting his body relax, and suddenly shift back to his mystique form. He felt drained, and just laid back stretching, trying not to think too much about what had happened to him. Randy knew that he should call his friends, and decided that it could wait a few minutes at least. Just lying back felt too good at the moment. As surprising as it was, Randy realized that as strange as he felt like this, he actually felt a little more comfortable than he had in his own form. That somehow, even though he could take his own shape, this seemed to be what his body considered its natural form now. That it would try to return to this shape if in another, leaving that stressed feeling he'd had. That thought left Randy feeling uncomfortable, and more determined to find out what had happened to him, and why. Randy woke up suddenly, realizing that he'd fallen asleep. Touching his breasts, he winced finding that it hadn't been a dream. Nervously, he sat up, and realized he had to go to the bathroom again. After a quick and embarrassing trip, he returned to his couch, thinking about what he should do. After a few seconds, he made another call to Tony, and was disappointed to not have an answer. Putting the receiver down, Randy remembered that he'd promised himself to call Jimmy and Chip to check on them. He was still afraid that whatever had gotten him had changed them as well. He didn't think that either of them would really mind too much, but he just had to know. Hesitating for a few seconds, afraid of what he'd get, Randy finally punched in the numbers and waited for an answer from Jimmy. "Hello," he heard in Jimmy's voice from the other end. Randy sighed and relaxed a little, noticing that Jimmy sounded the same as ever. "Hey Jimmy," Randy started to say, but was then interrupted. From the other end of the line, Randy heard Jimmy asking, who is this?" Randy suddenly cursed himself, having forgotten that his voice had changed. He certainly couldn't expect Jimmy to believe him if he claimed to be Randy while sounding like a woman. With concentration, he willed himself to change back into his own shape. As soon as he was back to his own shape, Randy continued on, "It's me, Randy." There was a silence on the line. "Man," Jimmy said, "you sounded like a chick." Randy chuckled appreciatively at that, thinking that it wasn't at all funny. "Well," Randy started, not exactly sure how to ask this, "have things been normal for you today?" When Jimmy seemed confused, and jokingly said that it wasn't, that he'd only woken up with 2 girls in his bed instead of the usual 3, Randy felt relieved. At least Jimmy hadn't been affected. "Have you seen Chip today?" Randy nodded at the response and asked if Chip seemed normal. When Jimmy asked what was up, Randy told him that nothing was up, though he knew Jimmy didn't quite believe it. Apparently both of his friends were perfectly fine, so Randy didn't think that they'd believe him if he told them. No, his only lead so far was Tony, who was still missing. Once Randy had hung up the phone, he looked down at himself, then reluctantly let himself shift back to Mystique. Since he seemed to be stuck like this, he didn't want to waste the time he could shape-shift back to normal. Feeling hungry, Randy went into his fridge, not surprised when he saw that it was empty. It was empty far too often, and he groaned, knowing that he'd have to go out in public again. He wasn't quite sure if he wanted to go out as a girl again, or if he was charged up enough to go as himself. After several moments of considering it, Randy decided to at least try going out as himself. Though he wasn't about to admit it, even to himself, the idea of going out as a woman did sound interesting, sort of like being in disguise. He smiled bitterly at that as he changed, realizing that at the moment, just being himself was a disguise. After making sure that he had his wallet, Randy hurried out, making his way off campus to McDonald's. While he was walking, he couldn't shake the feeling that he felt odd. He knew that it was because his body wanted to go back into that other shape, and he was able to ignore it, but still, it felt strange. Fortunately, he didn't have any problems staying in his own form, apparently having rested up enough earlier, which left him feeling rather relieved. When he'd finished gulping down his quarter-pounder, Randy reluctantly started on his way back to campus, hoping that he could get back to his dorm room before he needed to change back again. He didn't want to change in a public place, and could just imagine turning into a blue-skinned woman in front of a bunch of people. He shuddered at that. This whole thing was too embarrassing as it was. Randy looked around, not liking that he was out alone after dark. Normally it didn't bother him too much, but with what had been happening to him all day, he was afraid of just what else could happen. Not wanting to admit any nervousness, he snorted and just kept walking, keeping an eye out on the people around him. He felt a little paranoid mostly, and knew that he certainly had good reason for it. Suddenly, Randy froze, his mouth open in surprise. Standing just a little ahead of him was Tony. Or at least the girl that Tony was dressed up as the night before. Randy wasn't completely sure that this was Tony, but she certainly looked like it, including the prostitute clothes. Randy felt a smile forming on his face and his pulse speeding up. Finally, he'd found Tony. Excited, Randy hurried over to the girl, then stopped. "Tony?" he asked cautiously, and the girl just looked at him curiously, as if she didn't know him. "You'll wanna have a good time? It'll cost ya." She spouted off, looking at Randy as if he were a stranger. All he could do was stare at her surprised. The way she sounded. He was sure it was Tony. But why didn't she recognize him? And why was she acting like a hooker? "Tony, don't you recognize me?" Randy asked desperately. "It's me, Randy." I don't remember you, mister, she said slowly, but then, I do a lot of customers, and they're mostly the same to me. Randy stared at her in shock. But how did you know my name was Tony? She asked curiously, then giggled. I guess I must've told you last time. Sorry, I don't remember, but you wanna try again? Randy stepped back, horrified. What about that store you got your costume from? Randy asked desperately, only to have her look at him blankly again and ask what costume? Politely, he turned down her offer, leaving Tony behind, horrified at what he'd seen. That was Tony. He knew it. But somehow, she didn't remember it. Somehow, Randy knew, something similar to what happened to him had happened to her. He was sure of it. She had looked completely like a woman, and didn't even have that choker on from the night before. Slowly, Randy let himself walk back home, not liking how this was turning out. The only clue he had as to what did this to him was gone. Extremely disappointed, Randy went back to his room, letting himself shift back as soon as he was within the door, sighing at the relief he felt upon shifting back. Sitting down, he thought how ironic it was that he felt more comfortable like this than in his own body. But then, his powers seemed to think that this was his natural body. Trying to get as comfortable as he could, Randy took off his jacket and boots, carelessly tossing them aside. Sighing in relief, he started rubbing his toes, thinking that they at least still felt the same. Sitting up, Randy grabbed a comic book off of the stack on his coffee table, figuring that reading comics usually helped him relax. But as he saw that it was an issue of X Factor, with Mystique on the cover, he tossed it back down in disgust. Being reminded of his situation was not what he wanted at the moment. In disgust, he grabbed one of his breasts as if to prove a point to himself. The feeling of his hand on his breast made Randy wince a little. It felt so weird to have breasts like this. And what's worse, he thought to himself, they're nice and firm, and would look great on any woman. He just didn't want them to be on him. Randy carefully pulled his hand off, noticing that his nipples were pushing through the front of his costume very suggestively, and he was a little startled at how they felt. Carefully, he touched one with his finger, finding that it was warm and firm. And it felt sort of good. Randy kept staring at his breasts, his curiosity beginning to get stronger than his desire to deny what was happening. Finally, he decided that just a little peek wouldn't hurt, and quickly stripped out of his costume, knowing that he could probably just have shape-shifted out of it if he suspected right. Nervously, he looked down at his naked blue body, gingerly running his hands along it. Cautiously, almost afraid, he touched one of his nipples, feeling it again, this time without the costume in the way. Slowly, he started rubbing it, then the other one as well, amazed at how sensitive they were. How erotic they felt. It was almost like he had two small penises on his chest, that seemed to react to his rubbing them. Randy was amazed to feel a warm feeling beginning to develop between his legs, and moved one of his fingers there, almost surprised to find his vagina wet. Randy hesitated for a moment, thinking that it should be wrong to do this, but realizing that he masturbated in his own body, so what could be wrong with trying it in this body? Besides, it felt so good that he didn't want to stop. Letting his hands continue working, almost on their own, Randy moaned with pleasure as one hand played with his breast, while the other massaged his vagina. Unable to stop himself any longer, Randy continued to rub himself, sliding one finger into his moist and eager slit. Moaning again, he started moving it around, only increasing his pleasure. As his finger rubbed up against his clitoris, he found that it was even more pleasurable, so started playing with that directly. Slowly the pressure built up, and Randy felt a desire to have something in him. His vagina was practically demanding it. Sliding his fingers back in, he finally exploded in an orgasm that rocked through his whole body. Waves of pleasure seemed to spread through his whole body, leaving him gasping for air in their intensity. Still lying back on the couch, Randy smiled, amazed at how great that had felt, and how good he still felt. He felt as if he had a sort of warm glow through his body still. It felt so good. Without hesitating again, Randy started rubbing himself again, determined to experience it once more. After bringing himself to orgasm 5 times, Randy let himself collapse in exhaustion, completely amazed at how incredible he felt. And if masturbating felt so good, Randy couldn't help but wonder just what it would feel like to actually have sex with a man. Feeling satisfied, Randy finally drifted off to sleep, a smile still on his face. Randy woke up and got straight off of the couch, still amazed at the night before. He couldn't keep himself from smiling and whistling to himself as he walked around his dorm room, still naked. Touching one of his breasts, he couldn't help but smiling, thinking that although they felt rather strange to have on him, they certainly weren't uncomfortable. In fact, he thought they were actually rather fun to have the night before. Finding a small mirror, Randy looked at himself, carefully examining his features and his curves. He smiled, thinking that he actually was rather beautiful. Very exotic, but in a very attractive way. He chuckled, thinking about just how many other blue-skinned women were around, and different that made him. For some reason though, he didn't feel quite like a freak anymore because of it. Looking at the clock, Randy noticed that it was still fairly early, so decided to practice some with his new powers, hoping that he could learn to control them better, or at least get a better idea of just what he could do. For the next hour, Randy changed shape frequently, finding that it was getting just a little easier as he practiced. Sometimes he'd try to make himself look like people he knew or celebrities, with mixed results. He tried both male and female forms, and even tried other exotic forms. Randy finished up, pleased with himself. It was a lot of work and a lot of concentration, but he had a bit of fun and thought that he might miss the shape-shifting after he got changed back to normal. Trying to ignore the thought that he might not be able to, Randy thought about what he'd discovered. He seemed to be able to only increase or decrease his mass to a certain amount, and that whatever clothes he called up other than what he was already wearing seemed to draw from that mass limit. Overall though, Randy had enjoyed himself. After he'd gotten dressed up again in his costume, he looked at it rather skeptically, and changed it, turning it into the same costume Mystique had worn in the comics for a long time. All white, rather skimpy and with a long loincloth hanging down in front. Absently, he touched the small skull decoration that had formed on his forehead. Chuckling, he thought that this was definitely more in line with her as a villain, then willed the costume to change back again. Maybe, Randy muttered to himself, I'll work with the costume more later. For now though, he thought that he needed to find out what had happened. Randy tried to remember everything that had happened at the Halloween party, then gasped when he remembered his prize. He had completely forgotten about that prize medallion that Bill had given him for winning that lamest costume contest. Carefully, Randy tried to remember what Bill had said. Something about having gotten it from a wizard, and that it was supposed to help with any costume. It had certainly sounded like a load of shit, but now, Randy suspected that it wasn't. Especially when he remembered the strange feelings he started to get after putting it on. Just like the ones he got when he stayed in a shape other than Mystique's. Quickly, Randy ran to his bed and began digging around for where he'd tossed the necklace. He found the plastic necklace on the floor, and carefully picked it up, staring at the cheap plastic. It was all a dull flat gray, and Randy seemed to remember it having been red when it had been awarded to him. Holding it out in his hand, Randy just stared at it for several minutes, trying to decide what to do with it. He remembered that it had changed him into Mystique when he was joking around, saying he was her in disguise. Maybe, he wondered, if he put it on again, it would change him back. Gulping, he hoped that it would work, then willed himself to change shape, back into his own form. Or at least the form that he thought of as his real form. Then carefully, he slipped the necklace around his neck, hoping that it would keep him this way. After several minutes, Randy knew that it wasn't working. He still had that faint discomfort that he felt when he was in another form. In disgust, he tossed the medallion back onto his bed, trying to decide what to do next. Then he remembered Bill. Cursing himself for forgetting that Bill was the one who bought the prize this year, Randy decided that he needed to ask Bill a few questions. Since Randy didn't know Bill's number, and wasn't completely sure where his dorm was, he decided that his best bet would be to check out the comic shop. Bill tended to show up there fairly often, and it was a good possibility that either Bill would be there, or someone there would have an idea of how to get hold of him. After making sure that he looked like his normal self, Randy hurried out the door. As Randy walked over to the comic shop, he couldn't help but feeling a little guilty for skipping out on his classes, but he knew that what he had to do was more important. Still, his feelings of guilt didn't subside. Trying to ignore them, and that slightly uncomfortable feeling as well, he concentrated on finding Bill and getting back to normal. He shuddered at the idea of being stuck like this permanently. Sure, it had its good points, the shape-shifting and the night before proving that, but Randy didn't think that he wanted to live the rest of his life as a blue-skinned woman. By the time Randy got to the comic shop, he could feel the strain of retaining his form, though was sure that he could hold it for a while longer. He hadn't realized just how much he pushed himself that morning with his practice until now. Just as Randy was about to open the door, he was startled to see Kyle inside. On a sudden whim, he let himself change back into his Renee shape, this time making sure to turn his eyes into a more normal color and that he looked a little more his own age, though that was a more subtle change. "Oh, hi Kyle," Randy called out, watching amused as a surprised Kyle noticed him. "Renee," Kyle said smiling, looking a little embarrassed at having been caught with several comic books in his hand. Randy smiled, liking Kyle better already. Kyle held his small stack of comics behind him, looking self-conscious. "I used to read comics when I was in high school, but quit." Kyle gestured at his hands full. "When I saw this comic shop, I got curious to see how much things had changed in a couple years." Randy chuckled and Kyle recovered his confidence a little, asking, "What are you doing here?" "Why, I like comics," Randy said, enjoying the slight look of surprise on Kyle's face. Chuckling to himself, Randy knew that it wasn't expected to have girls liking comics, so this was a little bit of a surprise. "What are your favorites?" Randy asked, pointing at the ones in Kyle's hands. "I always liked the X titles," Kyle said pleasantly. Randy told him that those were his favorites too. For several minutes, Randy got caught up in explaining to Kyle all about some of the things that had happened in the X titles in the last couple of years, from Gambit working for Mr. Sinister to Onslaught. Finally, Kyle looked down at his watch and apologized, saying that he had to be going soon. He had a class that he didn't want to miss. "Talk to you later?" Kyle asked Randy, who smiled and just said maybe we'll bump into each other. Randy smiled as Kyle left the store, then shook his head, wondering just what the hell he'd been doing. He'd been so caught up in talking with Kyle about comics, that he'd even forgotten what he was here for. Randy felt embarrassed when he realized that Kyle seemed to have a crush on him, but for some reason felt rather good about it as well. Just being close to Kyle was making his heart race a little. Trying to clear his head, Randy looked around, already knowing that Bill wasn't there, but wanting to check again, just in case. It took Randy several minutes more before he realized that he was still in his Renee body, making him curse himself at how comfortable being female was getting. "I've got to get back to normal," he muttered to himself, looking around to make sure no one was watching, then changing back to his own shape. He didn't know how much longer he could stay like this and still keep his mind. Still keep his self-identity. Shuddering at the thought of liking it too much, Randy went over and asked the cashier if he'd seen Bill. The guy up front told Randy that Bill usually showed up every day around 1 o'clock to pick up some comics or just talk, so Randy thanked him and left. Looking at his watch, he saw that he had over half an hour's wait still. Feeling a little hungry, he went over to a small fast food restaurant just a couple buildings down, planning on grabbing something to eat and heading back. It wasn't until after Randy had left the comic shop that he realized the stress on his body had relaxed a bit since he'd spent time as Renee. That made him wonder if just being female was easier for his powers. He wasn't sure he liked what that meant and tried to put it out of his mind. When Randy